There are over 100 cases.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to our evening event here. The Upper Valley Democrats, in conjunction with the Lebanon Town Democrat or City Democrats, are putting this event together tonight. I'm Representative Mary Hackett Phillips. I represent Hanover and Lyme, for those who don't know me, but I'm also the chair of the Upper Valley Democrats. So pleased to be with you tonight and with our friends online. We are going to start this evening with a few announcements from a few of our members. And first up is the Honorable Lori Harding.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everybody, and hello, those of you who are online. So I just wanted to say a couple of words about the current state that we're in and give a couple of suggestions of things that I think might be really important for all of us. First of all, there's an economic blackout on Friday. You all might have heard about it. And that's really trying to give a message to the big business owners who signed on to 2025 that we have significant concerns. And what people are being asked to do is not do any shopping in big box stores, to shop locally on Friday, not fill their cars up on Friday, not order on Amazon on Friday. So we'll probably try and do this all over the country. There have been a lot of messages going out. You may have already seen them from people that you know in other parts of the country. So it's one small thing that we can do to give a signal that we're concerned. I think the other thing that's really important is if you know about individuals who've lost their jobs, if you have family members who lost their jobs, if you have people that you know that have not gotten services that they need, it's really important to call the governor's office, no matter where you live. Call the governor's office and also call your congressional delegation, primarily because people who are sitting in the offices don't know how this is impacting on people who are all over their states. So, for example, call Kelly Ayotte if you have a son or a daughter who's working for the VA and has lost their job or lost their research position, or somebody who may be in DC working for the CDC and has been told, don't come to work. So those things are really important for us to do, and it will give people a better idea who are making decisions about how it's impacting all of us. So, and there may be a lot more to come and a lot more that we need to talk about and get the word out. But those are two things that would be really helpful for right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Lori. Just one other announcement is that if you're feeling particularly riled up with some anxiety and concern, and you're not sure where to put that energy, we would like to invite you to join us in Hanover on Fridays between 4 and 5:15, downtown Hanover, and we're gonna just assemble near Town Hall on the sidewalk between Molly's and the Allen Street Alley. And we encourage you to bring a sign and join us with a little protest. We're going to displace our concerns to public in a very friendly and non-confrontational way by joining each other in one place and taking up some space downtown. We're probably going to do some sidewalk walking and in a short distance around the downtown area of Hanover and possibly occupy a little space on the corners. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, we would love to have you. Please join us. Okay, to set up some ground rules for this evening, I'm so pleased that you're here. We're just waiting for our guests to arrive. So tonight's event is entitled What Happened with Steve Marchand. So this conversation, which we really do hope to have, is based on a few ground rules. I just wanted to run through those with you and for the folks online. You know, this should be a discussion. It should be a give and take. And so we're hoping that everyone here will participate in questions when Steve finishes up his presentation. And as ground rules, I'd just like to say, for those who are viewing online, please enter your questions or comments into the chat, and we have folks who will be monitoring that and try to give real-time feedback to those in the room so that you can get your questions and comments inserted in the dialogue as well. For those here in the room, I just wanted to remind you that we're all going to have a chance to speak, so please, one at a time, if you will. Don't interrupt other folks so that all voices can be heard. And we just want to make sure that everybody remembers the basic ground rules from our past election series, that we won't be tolerating insults or attacks. So everyone just please mind your manners. Of course, we as the event coordinators reserve the right to end the event if someone should become too unwieldy. So after all that, if everyone's had a chance to participate, please jump right back in and participate some more. So don't be shy. Okay, so Steve Marchand has agreed to pass out some documentation. Has everyone received their packet? If not, I will pass those out quickly, or Lori will help. Thank you, Lori. So it's 6 pages of data that Steve plans to share with us, and I might be able to include that digitally as well. So just hang tight for a minute, we'll get that passed out for you. So let's just go to the first page, folks. This is 5 questions for our discussion, and we're hoping everyone can take a few minutes to think about their own answers before we start sharing as a group. So the first question is, when I say, quote, democratic values, unquote, as in the political party, what are the first 3 values that come to mind? When I say democratic values, quote and unquote, as in a political party, what are the first 3 values that come to mind? The second question is, what is the present brand of New Hampshire Democrats? What is the present brand of New Hampshire Democrats? The third question is, regardless of how you answer number 2, what should the brand of New Hampshire's Democrats be? If the answer is the same as number 2, should we just say that? Third question is, regardless of how you answered number 2, what should the brand of New Hampshire Democrats be? Number 4, who is the face of Democrats and of Republicans in New Hampshire right now? Who is the face of Democrats and of Republicans in New Hampshire right now? And number 5, what are the 5 most important issues to you right now? So what are the 5 most important issues to you right now? So those are the questions that are going to lead us off. Steve is here somewhere. Okay, great. So if everyone could just take 20-30 seconds to think about those responses and jot down any notes you might have, or make some mental notes, that'd be great. And so I'm going to just take a minute here to introduce our guest. So Mr. Steve Marchand is a native New Hampshire, Granite Stater, I should say, born in Manchester, according to Wikipedia.
That part's correct. Don't believe everything you read on Wikipedia.
That's right.
That's true.
He was mayor of Portsmouth from 06 to 08, according to my sources as well. But Steve has really been involved with statewide politics for a long time and ever since this point. So please just put that in your back pocket. Steve has an affinity for data and for information. So that serves, I'm sure, as the basis of his SRM consulting firm. He's also served as adjunct professor at UNH and the director of corporate relations at UNH. So big statewide higher ed champion. But right now he's serving as founder of the Move the Goalposts, and that's his capacity that we've invited him here today to speak with us. But the important thing to know about Steve is he's a dad, a husband, a sports fanatic,
Big time.
and he shares an affinity for long dogs. Just like I love dachshunds, he loves corgis. So please welcome our good friend, Steve Marchand.
The most important thing sort of went last. We love corgis. True story. So my 2 daughters are now in college, both in Canada, which we can talk about that if you want separately. That's a good idea. One's a senior out in Halifax at Dalhousie. The other is a sophomore at the University of Ottawa. And so my older daughter loves all kinds of animals, including tortoises. So she's had this tortoise for a very long time, and which of course is a very long time is but a fraction of the lifespan of the tortoise, which becomes relevant next because She doesn't live at home anymore, and the tortoise does. In fact, the certain type of tortoise is not allowed over the Canadian border, at least for now, which poses additional problems. About 2 months ago, we got the approval finally of my daughter Abby to find a foster home for Kit Kat the tortoise. We put it out, and within a few hours, we get several people, some strangers, some friends. And it turns out Representative Heather Baldwin is the foster mother of Kit Kat. And she's awesome anyway, but she got more awesome, and she has a corgi.
Okay.
So we went to visit, and the whole house is corgis. My daughter's finishing this week home. She wanted to visit Kit Kat because she's having some withdrawal issues of a sort. And that's great. I couldn't make it. So my daughter goes up and meets Heather and this beautiful home in the woods. And she meets the turtle. She meets the corgi. This couldn't have gone better. So I feel like Heather has become the sort of adopted family member of our family, which is delightful. That is not why I'm here tonight. But see, it's so awesome to know all your state reps. I am here because, and if you, I'll preface it with this. If you are into Substack, and some of you I think are, some of you probably are not, I still send out emails, but they've changed over time, and they're not ideal, I learned, to do long form. So Substack is a much better place for that. It's sort of a little bit like Twitter if a lot of the nasty people didn't find out what Substack was, and if you had an attention span longer than a gerbil, this is a really good place to be hanging out. It's a pretty thoughtful place. And so I put a lot of longer form work there that I'm actually quite proud of. Just today was a reflection, and it's at stevemarchand.com. So, and in fact, I'm not offended if you look it up now. It'll be the first story if you go there, because it's going to be part of what I'd like to bring up tonight. I've been doing a lot of these, about 20 of them so far this year, about 3 a week. Pretty much all over the state. And the goal originally was to present a slew of data, obviously in real time, get feedback. But what I was hoping to get more than anything was a reflection on the ground with the localized version of the data to say, are the findings that appear to be the case from this quantitative analysis that I've been spending time on, does this jive with what your experience on the ground in your given district or town suggests? And that was going like that for a while. And then very quickly, I realized if we had 90 minutes total for an event, we would spend 75 minutes or 60 minutes on that. And then we would end up getting kicked out of the building 30 minutes, an hour after the scheduled time ended, because the half or more of the time was spent on the same couple of topics that were never intended to be part of the original agenda. So it turned out like folks wanted to hear some of the data. I presented a truncated form. Often there's kind of a slideshow with much more. And we could do more of that at another time. I'll answer your questions about it for sure. But I realized I finally wanted to start getting at the questions that always seem to be coming up anyway that were much more big picture. And so the piece today actually was kind of the aha moment described. And tonight is me trying to do that better. So this is actually the first place where I take some of these questions for discussion that even if you don't write anything down, I'm not going to collect it or anything like that. I want you to think about it at the outset, because it turns out these are the questions that in some form are coming up every time in Francistown on Sunday. We have about 35 people show up in Francistown on a Sunday afternoon. And they just said, enough, I buy the data. Okay, great. Can we talk about what does it mean to be a New Hampshire Democrat? Somebody asked that question. I'm like, that's a really good question, because getting to that really gets at 4 or 5 other big things that we're kind of just making an assumption otherwise. And what if we're not on the same page on that? And indeed, it turned out we're not. Somebody said, how come the Republicans seem to always have a stronger brand than we do? Right or wrong? Obviously, we think mainly wrong. But why are they better at this branding thing? In fact, in New Hampshire, there are a couple of people that are clearly the face of the New Hampshire Republican Party. They said, Sununu and Ayotte, two obvious examples. But who's the Democratic equivalent of that? And there wasn't an obvious answer. And there's a lot of good reasons for that and some other reasons. And then the other thing was, what issues matter most to the kind of people that would show up on a Wednesday night in late February to listen to a guy that hasn't held elected office since January of 2008 and has no intention of ever trying to change that again? Like, why would you do that? Well, because you are, like me, a little bit odd compared to the rest of the population, but I think in a really good way. You care a lot, and this is part of how you flex your civic muscle. So we'll get into all of that, but this is why I throw this out for you to consider over the next several minutes. So obviously election night did not go as well as we'd like. Understatement number one. The polls immediately before election day, like the day before, suggested that Harris would win New Hampshire by 6 points, 7 points, maybe 8 points, and that Joyce Craig would lose the governor's race, but by a handful of points. It would be close, 2, 3, maybe 4 points. Well, as you know, both of those were off by a similar margin, roughly 6 points to the worse. We won, again, the presidential for electoral votes, but as a two-party vote, if you take out the third party and write-in, it was less than a 3-point victory. It was about 51.4 to 48.6. That's the closest it's been in quite a while, since 2016, but we've won it every time except once since 92. And then Joyce, obviously, I think we had high hopes that in an open seat, we might be able to keep that one close. And that one ended up being close to about a 9.5 point defeat. So one of the questions that comes up is, who the heck were the people that, depending how you frame the question, either were not being captured in the poll accurately? And by the way, New Hampshire was not the only state where this dynamic occurred. Several of the swing states, not all, but several of them, they all went to Trump, as you know. And a few others like ours that were not considered swing ended up being way too close for comfort. Places like even Minnesota and Virginia, even places like New Jersey. And then states that didn't get very close got a lot closer. States like New York State, which suddenly was decided by, I think, low double digits or high single digits, a state that traditionally has been one we don't even think about. All of these states swung towards Trump. So one way I would get at it when we look at the data, we don't have to wait for the Secretary of State to provide information in March. I think that's something that the party's waiting for. We don't need that. You could begin this process 48 hours after Election Day, which is why by mid-December, I was able to start doing this stuff. The headline is this: who did Kamala Harris invite on the stage as kind of a surprise surrogate or guest in the final weeks before Election Day? Liz Cheney. My daughter, the turtle daughter, she's 21, and they're both pretty politically engaged. We like politics as a family. And so she was confused about Liz Cheney. She goes, Dad, Liz Cheney. Now, she was born in 2003, which was a pretty tough year to be a Cheney. Well, it's a great year if you're Cheney at the time, but tough year for the rest of us. Cheney, is that the same Cheney as the Dick Cheney? I'm like, that's his kid, yeah. Because I thought the Democrats didn't like them. I'm like, we didn't like them really at all. In fact, I would argue the Cheneys were kind of public enemy number one in the Democratic Party in a lot of ways for many years. And while you always will accept the vote, I suppose, it created confusion with people that were a little young, old enough to vote. But my daughter's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And for Donald Trump, it was gold, because Donald Trump's reaction was not to say, well, I didn't need that vote anyway. It was much more offensive, which is the only way he knows. He said, see, I was right. They're all the same. He was running against the establishment Republican Party, I think Mitt Romney, as much as he was running against Democrats. That was true in 16 and then 20 and 24. Liz Cheney being on the stage with Kamala Harris was exactly what he had been describing was the case, to conspiratorial extent. But now it manifested itself on a stage on suburban Milwaukee as exactly as he'd been saying for the last 9 years. Meanwhile, and by the way, who was Harris and the Democrats trying to get with that? They were trying to get what they thought was the 3 to 5% of the population that were Republicans, but were very uncomfortable with Trump, mainly for character-related reasons, to a lesser extent, some like foreign policy, a few things. They were old school in that regard. And they thought they could peel him off. They weren't ready to go Harris, but maybe if we create the permission structure for folks like Adam Kinzinger or Michael Steele or Liz Cheney, that this would provide that and get you the 3 points. But that was a no margin for error plan. You had to run the table with that little narrow slice to get over the line in all of these swing states. And obviously that didn't happen. Meanwhile, while Liz Cheney was on the stage, who was Donald Trump hanging out with in the final several weeks? Not Liz Cheney.
Elon Musk.
Hanging out with Elon Musk. He was doing Joe Rogan.
All right.
Right? Has anybody here ever listened to the Joe Rogan show? Listen/watch. All right. There. Okay. How many of you have heard of Theo Von? Okay. Any of you ever watched Theo Von? Okay. I like stand-up comedy. Rogan, Theo Von, and a gazillion others. Their background, many of them started as stand-up comedians. And then splinter off in a variety of ways from there. So Theo Von had Donald Trump on his show. And if you go on, one of my pieces on the Substack site is about a rally I went to a year earlier than Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2024. I went there to a Donald Trump rally in Manchester. My wife and I did. I dressed very inconspicuously and no red hat, and we had 2 friends coming from Missouri that we knew. One had been the former Speaker of the Missouri House, a conservative Republican. The other worked for Senator Roy Blunt. So this was a conservative Republican, sophisticated family. They got us amazing tickets. They came to see candidates. There were only a couple. Haley and Trump was pretty much the show the weekend before the primary. I always take my friends to see whoever's around. They got us great seats. And I watched something I'd never seen before. It was not in a 92-minute speech. Donald Trump never mentioned abortion. He did mention Joe Biden's sports car. So he did that more times than any alluding to abortion. Because Donald Trump doesn't want to talk about abortion because he knows it's not a winning issue for him. And guess what? The crowd doesn't care. The crowd doesn't care. They may have opinions, but that crowd didn't care. They were there to be entertained. It is engagement. It is entertainment. It is culture. It is like nothing I've ever seen. Maybe a little bit of early Obama, obviously in a very different way, but early Obama had rock show vibes to it. Nothing else, I went to some like 1991 Bill Clinton stuff when I was a teenager in Manchester. That was pretty good, but that's nothing compared to this stuff. In that piece, I include a 9-minute segment from the Theo Von podcast that was recorded a few weeks before the election. This is what he was doing 2 weeks before the election. They're in a room with 2 chairs like this, no table, just 2 guys sitting about 8 feet apart, nothing in between them. Theo Von is a recovering cocaine addict. And I can't describe him properly. You'd have to watch it, go on the site, watch the clip. And Trump goes, so Theo, what's the high of cocaine like? What's that feel like? And, I've never used cocaine. So I'm like, okay. So he describes it vividly. Not around the kids there. Don't do that. And then Trump leans in. And he's like, okay, well, I don't drink because my older brother died basically of alcoholism. So I never drank. So compare the high of alcohol to the high of cocaine. How are they the same? How are they different? And I'm like, I actually would be interested in that. Like Theo Von would know that. And all of a sudden I'm 4 minutes in and I'm like, Trump, whatever, let's do it. And I got to tell you, I've been seeing Donald Trump since I was a little kid, and my mom had Phil Donahue on, and he was showing up on the Donahue show in the early 1980s. And I have never seen Trump so intellectually curious as he at that moment. It was just 2 guys rapping about overcoming the struggle of serious substance addiction. 9.5-minute segment, 16 million views. Okay? You can take your Liz Cheney stuff. Now, who is he going for there? He was not going for the 3 to 5% of college, generally college-educated foreign policy hawks who believed that the Iraq War was not such a bad idea, but that Trump's not a good guy. Trump knew he was never going to get that segment. They know who he is, and if they weren't with him yet, they weren't going there. And instead, he said there's this much wider audience of low engagement voters that the question for them is not, am I going to vote Democrat or Republican? The question is, am I going to vote? And if they did vote, and I didn't include this, it's in some of the slides that I do in other shows, as early as last spring, it was clear that low engagement voters were already breaking. This is before the Biden debate problem, by mid to high double digits for Trump. Low engagement self-described Democrats, either registered or leaning voting behavior, were already pretty heavily with Trump. Low engagement. Now, why is that? Well, actually, I'm jumping a little ahead in the stack, but and I apologize. I realized the folks at home probably
We shared it digitally.
Oh, that's great. All right, thank you. So actually, what is probably the last? Let me see if it's the last one here. Let's see here. Oh, second to last one. It's the one that starts with, what is the most important issue to you? Okay, that's the kind of three graphs here. This was taken in August of 24. This is after Harris was the candidate. And New York Times poll, I could have shown you 20 others that look just like this. And it basically said, okay, Trump voters, Harris voters, and those that are undecided or leaning, but say you might switch. What's the most important issue to you? Now, it's kind of like one of these, which highlights magazine, which one of these is not like the others kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So swing voters said inflation by a mile, then jobs, then immigration, then healthcare, and they generally meant the cost. And then you get to taxes, and then we start getting to stuff like climate, abortion, and so forth. But that's almost all the swing voters accounted for in those top 5 categories. Now compare that to the Harris folks and the Trump folks. Which one looks more like what a swing voter prioritized? It's pretty clear. The Trump folks, 75% of Trump voters said either inflation, immigration, or jobs was the number 1 issue. And then the number 4 issue was taxes. I mean, climate was at 0 for Trump voters. Climate was the number 1 issue for Harris voters. Again, if you look at swing voters, climate was pretty far down. Something that becomes pretty clear is that think of the world as 4 segments of voter: high engagement, low engagement, lean Dem, lean Republican. If you think of it like that, poll after poll starting last spring said the same thing. High engagement Republicans prioritize cost of anything: gas, groceries, rent, healthcare, everything, and immigration, which they also thought of as a cost issue. They thought of it as the cost of housing, more demand for the same supply, and they thought of it in terms of wage depression, more people fighting for lower half of the income scale jobs. I would tell you, especially talking to many family members of mine who reflect this, it was not xenophobia. I'm not saying there isn't that all, hanging out all over the place, but I'm saying there's millions of Americans that are, by the way, including immigrants of color, many of whom prioritize it just like this. It's an economic issue. Low engagement Republicans, exact same thing. Cost of everything, immigration. Low engagement Democrats, cost of living, immigration. High engagement Democrats, climate, abortion, LGBTQ, democracy, Trump's a jerk. One of the 4 quartiles was just completely different in their prioritization from the other 3 quartiles. And the most important point, that included Democrats that were lower engagement, less likely to vote. I'm not saying low information. They're not low information people. They're low information political information, but they're high information on other stuff in life, whatever their profession is, sports, culture, music, whatever, just like all of us have certain things that were high information and others that were low. Just politics, the irony is they were deciding the election, but they're not terribly political, which creates a quandary because now you have fundamental questions about how would you find them? Who are they? Do they have any prior voting history? Could you have seen them coming? What will they care about in 2 years? In a midterm election without Trump on the ballot, will they show up? There's a reason why Democrats at the state and national level have dominated special elections for several years now. Who votes in special elections? People that love to vote. I mean, you gotta love to vote. Primaries, even off-year elections, are a different animal from presidential year elections. And Trump has been building this over many years. And I will give, they say, hate the player, not the game, or vice versa. The New Hampshire Republican Party, I taught a class again this fall, you mentioned that, on campaigns for a bunch of MPA students, grad students at UNH. Many of the students are, it's pretty evenly split, Republican, Democrat, but they're all pretty political. The Republicans, they would tell me what some of their young peers who were working for campaigns or working for the party, the GOP, what they were up to a little bit, within the bounds of reason. And they were like, Professor, I was preaching, I'm like, the higher turnout is, the worse it is for Democrats. It was just very weird. But right now, that's where we're at because the low engagement voters, if they're showing up, they're voting Republican. And I'm like, I'm very worried about election day, about high turnout. Good for democracy, bad for Democrats at the moment. And they were like, look, Joe Sweeney, some of you know Joe very well, the Salem state representative, young guy, he's a selectman. He is an ambitious guy, whatever you think of him. He was one of the folks in charge of identifying north of 80,000 of this type of voter and getting a lot of them to show up, which is an important part of how you get from that 6-point delta from the pregame poll to game time. A lot of that difference are these voters that were not going to show up on any likely voter model. They were not going to make the screen on a poll of likely voters, but they showed up this time. And they almost snuck out New Hampshire for president, and they turned a pretty close governor's race into a big snoozer, and that had real impact down ballot. Those of you that have seen me speak before, and see if one of these reflect that, these don't. Okay, there is nothing that more causally impacts down ballot results than the gubernatorial race. All right, if you're running in a state house district where the governor candidate gets 45%, it is exceptionally unlikely that the Democratic candidate for House is going to be able to get 50.1% because you're asking them to do too much. Now, in Portsmouth or Hanover or Lebanon, even if there's underperformance, that number is still so far above 50%, it doesn't impact who wins and loses, although it does impact the margin. And that can have some other effects. If you're running in a bigger district, you need every vote you can get in the blue towns to make up, in some of the red towns in other parts of the state. But it cost us probably about 20 seats in the House. We had 198 House seats after 2022, an outstanding performance. We're at 20 fewer than that. So what are the 20? Basically, there are about 170, a little over 170 blue House seats in New Hampshire. That means there's 230 red seats. They're not all the same, right? There's really light pink and there's super red and blue. That means we have to run the table pretty much on all the Democratic seats. And then we have to go pick off roughly 30 to 35 red seats in order to get a majority. We almost did that in 2022. That's why it was impressive. The problem is that as soon as the wave doesn't lick as high on the shore, those light red seats come on back pretty quick. And there were a number of seats, even in Grafton County, that were, I think, some of our most attractive flip opportunities, some with some really outstanding new candidates that didn't work out. And I have to tell you from my time on the road the last 3 months, some of those candidates and some of those local committees got really discouraged. And I think some of them felt like they did something wrong. And one of my important messages, and my credibility, I mean, I'm a numbers guy, but I'm also a story person and I like people. And it's not their fault, right? Like if the top of the ticket was just, we can get into that, but the top of the ticket, it just was not a political environment in most of these districts that, some of the ones I'm talking about here in Grafton County. The math just didn't support it. In fact, one of the sheets I do have, which I worked a lot on to improve, and it's the one that has as a title, Grafton County PAYCO score. So PAYCO is something that I developed a few years ago, and I've refined. I like it a lot now. PAYCO stands for, I'll wait till folks get it. So yeah, it goes horizontal. And PAYCO stands for points above expected candidate outcome. I had to come up with something to make the vowel sound work out. Basically, what PAYCO does is it tries to answer a question. How much of a candidate's performance, House, Senate, executive, any race you want, how much of the performance, for better or worse, can be teased out as the responsibility, the credit of the candidate, her or himself, as compared to the environment? The reality is the environment is the dominant factor. Very few New Hampshire House candidates are going to be well known enough, famous or infamous enough, right? Infamous too, to really move the needle more than a couple of points above what the environment would have suggested, what I describe as a replacement level Democrat would have gotten. The number near the right side of it is Dem PAYCO, and that basically says how many more points above or below. I developed a generic model of what just a generic Democrat. You never heard of them. They got no baggage. They didn't serve on the local zoning board. They've never been arrested. They're just a Democrat putting their name on. And how would that person have done in my model? You see expected average Democrat percentage of the vote. That's basically what the model spits out and says, here's what a generic Dem would have gotten, given what we found out about 2024. And then the Dem percentage is what the actual candidate got. And so basically the delta, the difference, is PAYCO. If you go all the way to the left, I'm a sports fan. People like to sportsify their politics. And so people always ask about rankings and how did I do? And so here it is. There are 276 House Democrats who ran in a district that had a full ticket. You'll notice many Democrats in Grafton County are not on this list because a number of them did not run in a district that was full on both sides. And you kind of need that, or else it really it messes up the numbers very quickly. People leave it blank a lot, or they cross over. So these are the ones that ran in a full slate on both sides. And so out of 276, and of course, this is the full county. So some are not Upper Valley, but I just put it all up. So on election day, I got up super early and I wanted to see stuff in person. So at 8 a.m., I was in Berlin. You got to drive before the polls open. And then I crawled down to Whitefield, and then I went to Campton and Lincoln. Well, Lincoln and then Campton. Yeah. Okay. So part of the reason I did that is because those were all districts that were projected to be very interesting. And now, unfortunately, we lost everything in Coos County. They were interesting. At 8 a.m. when I got there, it was sleeting. It was the only bad weather in the state. What are you going to do? And I was with Corinne Cascade, a wonderful woman who unfortunately lost. And she would be the poster child for somebody who should be able to overcome a bad day for Democrats. Everybody knows her and she knows everyone. She's well liked, 40+ year educator, superintendent. She knows everybody. So I wanted to stand next to her for half an hour and just see what she thought. And after a while, there were folks we didn't recognize. And then a guy came out from the polling station and he moved the rope with the weighted the cones, and he moves it wider. This is like 8:30, 8:40. I'm like, sir, what are you doing? And he says, well, you got a lot of turnout pretty quick here. I need an extra aisle, basically. And they had heard me, higher turnout's kind of a problem. Who are these people that don't usually turn out? And, they're beep, beep. And then we go to Whitefield, similar kind of story. And then we get to Lincoln and Jerry Stringer. So I've known Jerry a long time, and Jerry and I are friends. And Jerry has consistently had one of the higher PACO scores in the time that I've been doing this. And I'm like, Jerry's going to need a PACO score that's pretty good if we get the big turnout and so forth. He has many of the characteristics of somebody who should be able to punch way above his weight. Well, it turns out he had the 13th best score in New Hampshire. And with a PACO score of 6.24, he did 6.25 points better than the model. I can tell you, that's extraordinary. That is extraordinary. And of course, the funny part is Lincoln actually was and Woodstock were pretty friendly. The model said he would have won anyway, but instead he took a close race and he ended up winning it by 16 points. Linda Massimia, but here's the thing. We can't just look at winning and losing and say, well, if you won, you're good at this. And if you lost, you stink at it. Because it's not that easy, right? So Linda, in a much tougher district, Linda won another very good candidate with a history of overperforming. The district says she should only get 44. She overperformed by 5.5. Again, 3 is really good. 3 is really good. A positive number is nothing to sneeze at. She does the 17th best in the entire state, but she loses. And she loses because even somebody as good at this as Linda, it's hard to ask somebody to overcome 6 points of wind at your face. It's basically, that's what we're talking about. So, and you can see Jared Sullivan was in a pretty easy district compared to many others, but Jared is a really compelling candidate. He's a charismatic candidate. He's an incumbent, which tends to help. And he had a very good score. And again, I look at somebody like Rachel Booth. That's an impossibly difficult district. But 65th best score out of 276, pretty good. Like, there's stuff to learn there. And so one of the things that I've been urging the party to do, I urge county and regional campaign committees to do, something I try to do, is we have lots of analytical tools and they help you go under the hood a little more and go beyond the where do we win, where do we lose. And some of the best candidates I've met in the 20-something years I've been around this stuff are the ones that don't win. And it's really important to encourage them. So this is, they can laminate this. It's okay. Sometimes they'll actually grab it and they're like, can I show this to my spouse? And I'm like, sure. I don't want to get in the middle of anything here, And they're kind of like, see, I knew my campaign was better than that. And I'm like, all right. And one thing I would say, because some folks obviously have the negative score. And so I also want to make it clear, there's an inverse to PACO. Republicans have a PACO score too, and it's the inverse of the Democratic score. So sometimes a pretty solid Democratic candidate will run against a very good Republican candidate. One of the best examples in New Hampshire was in Sullivan County. There was a young woman who was the chair of the Plainfield School Board by the name of Jenny Ramsey. Some of you may know Jenny.
My former student.
Look at this. It's such a small state. Jenny had all the fingerprints of a top tier non-incumbent candidate. The chair of a school board is quite specifically one of the best recruiting bullet points that I could look for in a new candidate. She worked very hard. She had fantastic volunteers. She has siblings who are sophisticated political operatives. I don't know what else you could do. She did the work. She raised the most money of any individual House candidate in New Hampshire. And it was like an R+1 coming towards Democrats. So it was this extremely competitive district. And she ended up losing by more than that. But I don't have it here. But again, the context that she ran in, there were 2 problems. One, it was a tougher environment than we would have projected. It went the wrong way. And here's the more important thing, the reason I bring up Jenny, the inverse thing. Her opponent is a very good candidate. I'm not talking about the policy. I'm talking about the nuts and bolts of why people vote for who they vote for. Is it Margaret Dry? Yeah. Okay. That's something that I remember talking about with Jenny and her folks. Like, she's tough. She's tough. She overperformed 2 years ago. Like, she's tough. So sometimes you get the old cliche of the immovable object versus the irresistible force, like some kind of superhero movie. Sometimes you can get a 0 PAYGO score, but it's not because they both stunk or they both were generic. Sometimes it's because they're both actually pretty good at their own game, and they end up crossing out each other's superpower, so to speak. And you end up with a score that can actually be very low or even slightly negative, but you could have a -1. But if you're running against a top tier Republican opponent, you're actually dealing with this. Dan Wolf, who finally retired, but Dan Wolf was probably as good an example in New Hampshire of a Republican who was just wildly overperforming. And indeed was, some of you would know better, but maybe the most moderate Republican in the House at that point. So, Greg Sargent was a delightful, very sharp, young, new candidate. He runs, he does the work, but you're running against Dan Wolf, he doesn't win. But Greg does a lot of things well. He learns a lot. He becomes a better candidate. Dan announces he's not running again. Greg says, I am running again. Dan recruits a pretty good candidate, but not as good as Dan Wolf, because nobody was going to be as good as Dan Wolf. Greg was a better candidate. Greg ends up winning by a decent margin. That district, now that Democrats have it, you never want to take things for granted. But in these districts where the partisan voter index, which we'll talk about in a second, as it floats away towards Democrats, it becomes harder and harder for the in this case, the Republican Party to get it back. In Stratham, I'm blanking on his name now, the gentleman who was a longtime Republican state rep, he lost in 2022 to Zoe Manos, and then
Abrami.
Thank you, Pat Abrami. Okay. Then he ran for state senate in 24. Stratham used to be Republican. It's now D+7 almost, which makes it safe Democrat. It's beyond flip. It's beyond purple. It's safe blue. It's becoming like Portsmouth has leaked out because of real estate values everywhere. Kind of like how Hanover, Lebanon, real estate values are leaking, and all of a sudden towns are slowly getting bluer as people are moving further away. This happened to Stratham, but Pat was able to survive probably 4 years beyond when a guy like that should have lost in Stratham. It's really hard to take out an incumbent from their seat. But once you do, Zoe was very concerned the whole election. I love Zoe. Zoe was, and I know you guys do too. Zoe was like, Steve, is it going to work out? I'm like, Zoe, it worked out last time when you had to beat Abrami. Now you're the incumbent and you're not having to run against Abrami again. And Stratham got bluer in the last 2 years, and she ended up winning, and they got a great pair of reps there. So the context matters in all this. One other data element I do want to mention, and it's actually 2 pages. And this was very last minute. I meant to do this earlier. Thank you for doing this about such short notice. So this is alphabetical. Again, it's not just Upper Valley. I'm sorry, it's not just correct. It's not just Upper Valley, but alphabetical. And so these numbers, you'll see they're vertical. They are 2 pages. One starts with Ashland, the other with Hebron, and they're pretty much all the towns in Grafton County. And the number you see there, and it's a really important number for the work I do, is called the PVI. It's the Partisan Voter Index. And it basically says how much more Democratic or Republican is in this case, your town in statewide elections than the state overall. So presidential, US Senate, governor, statewide election, general election. How do they vote relative to how the state votes overall? And so these numbers you see are for how they acted that year. So what I do when we have the ability to show it is there's some kind of neat new graphics that can show different lines over time that really help highlight trend lines. And there are some towns flying in the blue direction. They tend to be higher education, higher income. Suburban towns are quickly moving that way. Then there are the ones flying in a Republican direction. And they tend to be blue-collar towns, small cities, very rural. By the way, just like America. I mean, just at Coos County, Berlin used to be the most Democratic performing city in New Hampshire. and is now a Republican performing city. It's also dramatically shrunk in population. It's not so much that the people have changed, like new people have moved in or anything. It's that the people who live there have changed parties. They haven't changed. A lot of them were kind of ancestrally my kind of people. As a West Side of Manche guy whose parents are from Quebec. These are folks that generally don't have a college degree. They're disproportionately French Canadian, work in the trades, old school, you name it. You know the story. A lot of them are Catholic, wildly disproportionately Catholic, and socially more conservative than today's Democratic Party, but ancestrally Democrats. And as the piece I wrote today discusses, there's always a long lag time between when a party changes some of its values and its branding, and when people who grew up with that brand of what the party used to be finally become sufficiently uncomfortable with the delta between the party they knew and the party that is. And then there's a certain point where they're like, I can't do this anymore. I mean, this kind of happened to my parents, and some of you have heard me talk about this. My parents liked Bernie Sanders in 2016. They loved Bill Clinton back in the 90s. They're immigrants, neither with a high school degree. They're both retired. My dad's a retired carpenter, French first language of the house, the whole shebang. Bernie was, they like Bernie. They like we gotta blow some stuff up. This system is not working for people like my family. Bernie doesn't win the primary, obviously. And not only does he not win it, it happens in a way that, not unlike Liz Cheney walking on stage in October, it sort of confirms a narrative that they see that the system really is kind of stacked against folks like my parents. And so what do? They don't vote for Hillary. They vote for Trump. And then in 20, they vote for Trump. And then in 24, they vote for Trump. Luckily we have a really good relationship, so we can talk candidly about this stuff. And I find it, I don't try to teach. That's the wrong answer. I'm not teaching my folks about politics. They're teaching me about politics. All right, that's what's going on. There's education to be had in every corner. But it also provides, I'll get back to them in a minute because it provides opportunity. But basically, this is happening in every town in New Hampshire. Every town and region in New Hampshire has these tectonic plates, like an earthquake waiting to happen. They're always moving under your feet. You don't feel it because they're moving slowly. And then one day, they've moved enough that suddenly Bedford has 2 Democratic state reps. Even in a year, we held the 2. What was that? That's like a little mini earthquake there. But then the other side happens. Coos County, Corinne can't hold on. Uh-oh. Eamon Kelly, prominent family. Uh-oh. And we go like, bang, Coos County, earthquake, complete, bang. This happens in both directions, right? So if you look here, now in the Upper Valley, the negative number is obviously Republican. That's coincidental. I'm not trying to make an additional political statement. The positive number means it's Democratic. So pick any town you want. Somebody name a town. You know, Tom, I'm going to pick Canaan.
Yeah.
There you go. I see you. All right. And frankly, Canaan's one of the more interesting towns in the region.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, as you know. Yeah, you don't want it to be as interesting. Huh?
Yeah, it's like the Chinese curse. Maybe you live in an interesting time.
You don't want to be, yeah, that's true. Right. In Hanover, Lebanon, you don't want things to get interesting. Right? In other places, I would love for it to get interesting. Like Wolfboro, getting very interesting. Going to be there next week because it's getting very interesting. One of the most important towns in 2026 for Democrats because it's getting very close to, it's definitely purple. So there's different kinds of interesting.
Steve, before you
Sure.
you talked about the impact of the governor.
Yes.
The gubernatorial race on the rest of the town ballot. Tell people what goes into the PBI.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the PBI is basically an average, but with a caveat. It's an average in each of these cycles. So take, let's see. Well, it basically, whatever statewide elections between president, U.S. Senate, and governor occurred that year, there's an averaging of it, but the governor's race gets more weight. And that's a key difference between how the state party has traditionally looked at a similar number, how the national party, Charlie Cook, if you like that stuff, Cook Political Report, they have versions like this. I weigh the governors more heavily. And I do that. And over time, I found others are coming to me on it. Because if you care like I do primarily about down ballot races, the governor's race has a much heavier thumb on the scale of what happens down ballot. So if you don't weigh it, then, for example, if you're treating Harris and Craig as having the same impact on your state rep race, then you're missing a little bit there. I'm not saying Harris didn't matter. Directionally, it definitely matters. Congressional, by the way, I don't bring that in because it doesn't really matter. In fact, if you look at it, in almost every ticket, in every town in New Hampshire, it's the same pattern. Harris, I'm going to pick a number, but you could change it. Harris gets 48% in a town. Craig will get 40, will get like 40. Then the congressional candidate, whether it was Maggie or Chris, will get 48, often 49. They'll do a little better than Harris did. And then executive council, it crashes back down. Higher than Craig, but lower than the federal candidates. And then we get to state senate and state house, and it's the same thing. So what you find is down ballot state candidates recover some of what they get, of what the governor's candidate gets, but they can never get back to where the federal candidates got. And so the higher the gubernatorial provides, it turns out, a much more immovable object, a number that ends up getting tethered to the down ballots because voters across the state generally are able to bifurcate their vote. Federal candidates and how they feel about the Democratic brand, which in a moment we'll get to the question, they feel a certain way about it. And the state brand of the Democratic Party, they have a separate feeling about it. Sometimes they may be similar, but that is coincidental. So if your gubernatorial candidate is, your state brand is a certain way, the down ballot candidates, with all respect to those of you in office, people don't know a lot about you beyond a certain high information voter, particularly in a presidential year where that kind of median information level gets lower as more people are turning out. So they don't know, especially in a multi-seat district, to ask a low engagement voter who didn't vote in the midterms or a primary, they may not have even voted in the 2020 presidential, to be like, so who's your sixth favorite state rep candidate? In fact, what we find is in one-on-one state rep races, the participation rate is almost exactly the same as governor, president, and Congress. If 97% of the people that walk into the booth vote for governor, 96% of them will vote for state rep, as long as it's a one-on-one choice. As soon as it becomes a multi-seat, it collapses by at least 8 to 10 points. The reason, I think.
Ballot fatigue?
What's that?
Ballot fatigue?
I don't think it's that, because in some ballots, what we find is the non-float, which appears above the float, the non-float will be the multi-seat, and then the float will be a single seat. And then the participation rate bounces back up to like 95% again, below the multi-seat. So they stick with it. The problem is there's a certain percentage, it appears about 8 to 10% of voters who go, vote for no more than what? And that's very weird. And so they go, I didn't come here to vote for, I came here to vote for president. I'm not going to spoil my whole ballot because I vote for 3, but it seems like I probably shouldn't. I'm just going to vote for 1. And then they leave the rest blank is what appears to happen. And that delta for a certain percentage of, not a lot, but it's like 8% of the voters. Well, if one of the two parties could figure out how to communicate that, and neither has, that would be an enormous tactical advantage for that party. I estimate it would have be double-digit gain in seats for Democrats if that's all we did better. Instead of 178, we'd probably be around 190. If the only thing we did better was figure out how to get the Democrats who drop off like that to fill it out in these multi-seat districts. There's a lot of seats, including in some of the big suburban districts in Manchester and Nashville area, where we won a few, but we came pretty close to one more. That one more is an example of what you get if you could turn the 87% participation back to the 95. That same person, they're willing to do the rest of the ballot. So let's go back to Kane.
Steve, I do have a question
Oh, sure.
for you, and I'm not sure if it's a good one right now, but
Okay.
the question is, you mentioned a metric for candidates who outperform the party,
Yes.
and what sets those candidates apart?
Oh, so the characteristics. Yeah, let's do it. So that's the PACO, right? The points above expected candidate outcome. And so there are some things. Now, some of this will be very intuitive. For example, retired educators. Yeah, but you knew that. Current or recent past local elected officials. There's something about getting elected in a nonpartisan election, which by definition means, and even in a small town, probably hundreds of Republicans voted for you gladly. And there appears to be, and this again, it's not a big reach, that if somebody has voted happily for you on a ballot in March or in a city in November of a different year, and then they see your name again and they're like, all right, particularly relatively low information voters who are going disproportionately on name ID. It's a pretty valuable thing. So you got high engagement voters who follow what you do locally and hopefully like it. And you have lower engagement that if they did run across your name at some point, that is a powerful factor. So that appears to be one. Another one, this one required a little more work. This is something I'd like to do over the next 18 months, but it appears people with kids in the local school district at the time that they're running. Now, God bless you if you can do it, because that means you're probably in the peak of your working life making $100. You know, that's a whole different discussion. But there is, I started doing this research many years ago, actually in Portsmouth for local elections, where I was able to match people that had school-age kids with voter participation in local elections. And it turns out one of the main predictors of how somebody goes from a non-voter to a voter is when their oldest kid enters the public school system. You suddenly have, and right once you say it, you're like, significant skin in the game. And I'm a dad now, the kids are older now, but yeah, totally. I cared a lot more. The other one, by the way, is when somebody goes from renter to homeowner. Because now all of a sudden I'm paying taxes. I mean, you were before, but now you're getting a bill. There's something to that. But the kid part of it is it's almost primal and it's powerful. So this goes back to there are some of these districts where folks that had or have a bunch of kids that went through the local school system. That's a pretty awesome, think of all the things. Coaches. By the way, the number one PACO score in New Hampshire was Mark Vallone, the state rep from Epic. Mark is a guy. He's a dude. He is a retired teacher and principal. His parents and his grandparents had a general store in Vallone. People weren't voting for Democrat Mark Vallone. They were voting for Mark or Vallone, if you know what I mean. Not only did he win, he was the top vote getter in a four-person, two-seat race in a district that is collapsing for Democrats. It's now R+7. Anything beyond the sixes, that Mark's win, his PACO score was 16. Wow. 16. There were only two people in double digits in the entire state, and the other one was 10. Like, he is so far ahead. He's going to be, when I do a little Hall of Fame, like a little shed in my yard, and people can go to the induction ceremony and stuff. Mark will probably be an early inductee, and hopefully people will spend money on popcorn when they go. But Mark is out of control. But he is all the stuff you'd ever want, and his demographics. There's also evidence. Guys tend to do a little bit better in red districts. Women do a little bit better. Like a female Republican gets a little bump, and a male Democrat gets a little bump. It's not a huge bump. It's not immovable bump. But there appears to be an assumption, and my own polling when I ran for governor, actually, this was jumped off the page, there are a lot of guys, and this is getting more extreme if you look at the exit polling from Trump in 24. There are a lot of guys who, if they see a Democratic guy, and to be put a very fine point on it, a straight white guy, would be me. I'm pretty this, like whatever this is, I'm in. And they see that and they go, okay, that guy can't be that liberal. And it's the same thing. Like, it doesn't hurt that Kelly Ayotte is a 50-something, a Gen X woman who is sort of understated and pleasant in her own way and all that kind of stuff. And so you see her, and the first thought you have is she's probably a pretty moderate Republican. And then you brand it with Sununu. Like, we had 8 years to try to brand Sununu as not what he ended up being able to hold on to. He left with a 62% approval rating, and he was able to bestow a lot of that halo, as much as one can, to Ayotte, taking advantages she already had and doubling down on it. So there's that brand, which kind of gets to another question we'll get to in a minute. So those are some of them. So most of those are pretty obvious once you dig in. Some are, one of the things I do now is I spend time in some of the more interesting places where the data points jump out. And you try to go and spend time with the candidates, even if they lost, and ask a lot of questions. So talk about your campaign, you know, and you learn stuff. And sometimes that's how you find these maybe more subtle factors. So in 6 months, I might have an even more nuanced answer. Yes.
Steve, hi. I'm Deborah Merrill Sands from Portland.
Great to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. So help me with this. So let's say I were to show these data to somebody.
Okay.
I still don't know what the story is. So if
Okay.
you looked at the Orford line, what's the
Yes.
story there?
Okay.
Because I don't understand, like, what's 9.88 compared to 13.57?
Yes. Okay.
What does it mean?
Okay. So let's look at Orford. That's on the second of the 2 pages. And so the headline is this: the bigger the positive number in this case is, the more Democratic it has been performing relative to the state average in statewide elections. So what's one of the things about Orford that's interesting is, and this is where data, there's always noise, right? Like, there's some margin of error in all of it. And you see all the way on the right side, it says 2026 PVI. That is not because I'm a clairvoyant and we already know what's going to happen. It basically is a rolling average, in this case of 20, 22, and 24, that's weighted to go into the 2026 cycle with a number that is an approximate projection of what it will be in 2026 for preparation purposes. And you're trying to project, which races to invest time and money and this sort of thing. But the other 5 numbers are what actually happened that night. So in Orford, this past election, Orford voted 9.88% more Democratic than the state in statewide races, which is a big number. Anything more than 6 is a really big number. But Orford's interesting because it's been very noisy, right? In 2016, it was 9.7. Then it bounced way up to one of the highest in the state, 15.5. Then down a little to 12.7, up again to 13.5, and then back down to 9.9. The rolling average says entering 2026, it's probably bluer than it actually acted in 2024 because it was so much bluer all 6 years prior. And so it projects that in 2026, Orford will be about what we'd say D plus 12, which is great and necessary in that House district because the other parts of it are not so blue. So you need to wring out the blue, and then we work on the ones that are a lot redder. Oh, yeah. Good question. Yeah. Right. So 2 parts on that. That's an excellent question. Oh, yeah. So the question was, what was Orford's PVI back in the day when Mel Thompson got elected governor? So that's a lot of fun. For those of you that either were not around, perhaps literally, or just don't follow the stuff as closely, he was the governor for a good chunk of the 70s, 72, 74, 76. Very conservative, right? Luddite levels. Yeah. Made national news. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to overstate. And then he ran for
nuclear weapons.
Right. Let's use nuclear weapons. And he was the first one to try for a fourth term, as Tom knows well, and lost to Hugh Gallen, which was the first Democratic win in, I think, 16 years at that point. We had been in a drought. We better win one soon, or we're going to be in a drought that actually competes with some of our longer droughts of the 20th century. But Orford, if I had done a PVI in the mid-70s, two things would have almost certainly happened. One is, it likely, although I would have to check it, it wouldn't have looked like this. That's the first thing. It wouldn't have been anything like this kind of heavy blue. Second, Newfields is actually a really funny example because we had both our Republican governor and Democratic senator from the little town of Newfields. Maggie Hassan lives in Newfields now, and so does Chris Sununu. So Newfields had this really funky thing going on because it had a hometown advantage for Chris and Maggie. You don't get that in a little town like almost anywhere. A governor and a U.S. senator, both, successful multi-term from the same town of 5,000. That's pretty crazy. And that messes up your PVI. So when you do get a hometown advantage for a statewide candidate, it can actually influence the number, but that's where the rolling average over time will kind of wipe out those little blips that would otherwise make it funny.
Not to get provincial, but just to go back to Canaan.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Because I know the numbers. To prove your point, in 2024, Harris won Canaan by 219 votes.
Okay.
Joyce won Canaan by 2 votes.
Yeah.
I won Canaan by 150. That's your point.
That's it. You get back a lot of it, but it's almost even you. And I'm not just saying this as your friend and because you're here, but you're really good at this stuff, and you can't get back all of it. Like almost nobody gets back all of it. There's a handful of examples, and they usually have these extreme stories like Mark Vallone's story. There's a reason why Mark Vallone's going to be on the Hall of Fame wall. They don't just put anybody on there. That's a really weird set of circumstances. And it's also why when you get a situation like that PACO score of Grafton County, where you get some of these, Jerry, Linda, Jared, Rachel, those are not 4 identical people. These are some pretty different people. We got men, we got women, we got younger, we got older, we got folks that are incumbent, we had we got the whole shebang there. And that's the thing that I think is, and I think this is a really important point to hopscotch to what do we do, kind of a 2026 and beyond thing, is this. I think for too long, I've just heard too many people in the party, and I don't mean just like the chair, or I'm saying like across the board over many years, that have sort of said, we have so many state house districts, in particular state house, and they're so small that we cannot really get surgical with it to the level that we'd like to, because it would be too inefficient and expensive, and frankly, too time intensive, too labor intensive. And I think that's actually giving away the single biggest advantage. Like, if you actually do the work, you will find that the advantages are all around you. Like, there's again, not safe for kids, but pretty good movie. What is it? Any Given Sunday, the football movie with Al Pacino as the coach. It's got all the Al Pacino expletives, which, I like that. But whatever. So he gives this often memed speech before the big game in the locker room. And he gives this speech in Al Pacino style about how life is the 6 inches all around you. Football is a game of inches, just as the grizzled, beaten down Al Pacino character, his life is a game of inches. And it's the 6 inches in front of your face that are the difference between winning and losing. And I would argue that is the same thing with this. The advantages is if you learn the candidates, if you identify the unique advantages, if you understand the local community, if you see the trend lines of PVI, if you understand the PACO score, and a dozen other ways that you can do this, Every one of the 203 districts is its own story. It means you either need, maybe you need more money. I'm not sure about that. I think you could spend the money differently and you could do a lot more with it. I'll tell you this, I spent a lot of time with a lot of candidates in the last several months of last year. And I had more than a few of them, and they were men and women, retired and young people, Senate, House, the whole shebang. And I would hear stories like this one. There was one candidate who was in an extremely competitive race, and I won't say who was campaigning, except it was a male, I will tell you that. And that candidate was knocking on doors and was reporting to me every couple of days saying, hey, here's what I heard. It's matching the data. The story you're telling is what I'm getting. And the story was that candidates were too often going to relatively high engagement voters that it was thought, since they're pro-choice, if we focus on choice and we're good on choice, then they will vote for us. And here's 10 mail pieces about it. And so this given candidate, hey, Karen, ladies and gentlemen, your executive counselor, look at this. Hey, look at this. Everybody's there now. There we go. So this pro-choice male went to a door of somebody who said, listen, I'm pro-choice, but that's right now, my grocery bill, my rent's going up, my kids, I'm supposed to pay for college, they're going through the list. It's all legitimate. I mean, it's legit. And they're going, when you keep sending me abortion mailers, you're telling me that you don't get that even though I'm with you, you don't get my life right now. And all of a sudden, this candidate comes back and says, Steve, I had a 10-minute argument with as a pro-choice candidate with a pro-choice voter about abortion. That's insane. And it meant because we were focused on alignment ideologically, when that's not the game now. The game is alignment prioritizationally. That's the game. And if we're misaligned on priorities, we're going to lose. And that is that's in some ways, that is sort of the core of the whole thing tonight. People are willing to even disagree with you on issues that they don't think are top tier issues, as long as they A, agree with you on the very most important issues, and B, think that you're aligned on what the top issues are. So one of the last pages I have here, it is another horizontal page. I think it might have been the last one in the stack that starts with what Americans said were. So this was not before the election. This was after the election. Indeed, this was last month. And the New York Times did a poll with Ipsos, a high quality poll that basically asked voters, so what are your top 5 issues? And then they said, what do you think Democrats' top 5 issues are? The brand, the national brand. And what do you think the Republicans' top 5 issues are? So remember that chart I showed you earlier about the swing voters before the election and how the swing voters seem to align in their priorities with the Trump much more than Harris? So this is before and after picture. That was before. We know how they voted. Didn't go well. So now the election's over, only a few months. So, I'm not saying everything, fixes overnight, but here's what they think 2.5 months after the election. They said the economy, healthcare, immigration, taxes, crime. Okay? I don't know, and I'm not going to ask to look at it or anything, but if you had a chance to answer one of the questions that I propose you consider, the bottom one of it, what are the 5 most important issues to you right now? Now you've received the answers on the quiz, so maybe it's not fair, but here's what voters think the Democrats answer that question. Abortion. How many of you would have put abortion on your top 5? I think more of you would. How many of you would have?
You already gave us the answer.
I know. How many of you would have said climate? Right? I mean, come on, that's a big time issue. Democracy's on the line. Okay. Healthcare. Yeah. By the way, and that's the one that meshes up with what the voters said. It's kind of like they're kind of telling us the Republicans stink at it. You guys, we think, care more about it. Something's sitting there. Like, I mean, that's one that we probably should be thinking about. And the voters don't think we put the economy in the top 5. That's a zilch. Like, you're not winning anything if they don't think that. By the way, even if we are, if the voters perceive that we're not in the game. We're just not in the game. And immigration is kind of an interesting one because I think Democrats, we're kind of in a pickle on that right now. What is the Democrats' position on immigration right now? Anybody want to take a shot at it?
Well, I will say.
Yeah, take a shot. Yeah.
Well, I will say that Biden sent more folks out of the country than Trump has so far. Whether that's a Democratic message or position, but that was a reality.
It's true. Now, what is Trump? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I don't want to.
No, I was going to say their position is they want a comprehensive immigration policy, that covers everything that needs to be fixed, basically. They don't have, the problem is I think it's too broad of a thing for people to understand. People understand a wall because it's simple. Okay, ineffective, but simple.
And symbolic, right? A wall, which we've all lived in places or visited places that had walls. I mean, it's funny, my kids are too young for this, but I'm a child of the 80s. When I hear the wall, the first thing I think of is the wall between Eastern and Western Europe. That's the first thing I think of. I think of Berlin. That's the first thing I think of. These days, I think more of Berlin. But as a kid, I thought much more of Berlin, and had a chance to visit it a few years after. I mean, I remember that as a really important moment of my life. It was a defining characteristic of the first 15 to 20 years of my life. But it carries this symbolism to your point is shorthand for all millions of dollars of ads, right? When you're explaining, you're generally losing, and the wall avoids any explanation. To a fault.
Steve, do we want to officially open it up for people to share feedback who were involved in the campaign about what they observed and how it fits with what you've described?
Yes, please.
Folks, if you're online, you can enter things in the chat. If you're in the room and you want to speak to that or ask another question, just
Well, no, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say something to brand. Because Republicans brand Democrats. Democrats don't brand Republicans, and they need to start doing that. All you hear is socialist, socialist, socialist. Okay. And, and open borders and stuff like that. And they're branding Democrats with that. Democrats need to start branding back. And then also, what is the Republican brand? I don't really know what the Republican brand is other than, tax cuts for the wealthy. Okay. But I don't think a lot of people see it that way. Some say, oh, they're for, tough immigration policy. But is that really a brand? I don't know.
I think tough on crime and low taxes is over.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
And there's some clue to what Joe Voter, right, or Mary Voter thinks. At least as of late January, what they sort of think the Republican and Democratic Party care about, which is a decent, not perfect, but decent proxy for how they perceive brand right now. And they do put taxes and immigration as 2 of the top 3. They also put guns, which neither of the other 2 buckets mention guns. But Republicans definitely own the gun argument. And I would note, and again, I don't mean it as a shameless plug, but there's another story from last week. I spent a lot of time on it. I'm pleased with it. It's about what Democrats can learn from the NRA. And at stevemarchand.com. And it's I teach a book called Firepower as part of my grad course that is a great book about the history of the NRA and how it combined ideology and identity over many years into this combined force that the author refers to as ideational power. And ideational power basically allows a gun owner to almost be unable to distinguish over time the difference between the ideology that we say, freedom, the Second Amendment, whatever, from identity. I own a gun, and that means I believe in these. It becomes almost one melded. And so what happens over time is when other parts of the Republican coalition come in, like in 1970, the idea that there'd be CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, and they would have booths next to each other. And that one day there'd be this pretty inarguable coalition with the NRA in one booth, and then next booth is the Susan B. Anthony pro-life group. And then next to it would be a cryptocurrency group. And then next to it would be the Make America Healthy Again, Robert Kennedy thing, which has definitely been stitched into the coalition. What do these all have in common? That basically what happens, it goes back to earlier, people will, whatever their number one issue is, they will align with the party that strongly aligns with them on that. So if you're a gun owner, it is very difficult to get a Republican who prioritizes guns to move to the Democratic Party right now. Even if they're personally pro-choice, they're willing to go with the flow with the Susan B. Anthony folks, as long as the Susan B. Anthony folks are willing to go with the flow on the gun folks in a way that is far more efficient and durable than what our very fractious Democratic coalition has typically done, where there's, I would argue, it's a loaded term, but more of a purity test. Hey, if you're, I mean, I'll mention it. I think he won't mind. I've heard him talk about it publicly. I mentioned Mark Vallone earlier. Now, I'm about as pro-choice as you can get. When I ran for governor, I was the first person ever to want to codify abortion rights in the state law. Abortion rights groups actually said it was a bridge too far at that time. Now you couldn't win a Democratic primary 6 years later if you didn't want to codify it in the law. Okay, so that my cred on that is that Mark was one of maybe the only, but certainly one of the only Democrats who supported a 15-week abortion ban bill at one point in the last few years. Now, I don't agree with him on that, but I do agree with him on almost everything else. He's a strong union guy, and he's a strong public education guy. He's an environmental guy. Like on the others, I'm with him on the other stuff. I disagree with him on that one. I also know that if that's his belief system, and we had primaried him because he wasn't good enough on that, he might have been able to be defeated on that because that's a hot issue in a low turnout primary. And then whoever beat him in the primary would have lost by a gazillion votes in the general election, and the House would be 223 to 177 instead of 222 to 178. And Mark's good votes on 95% of the stuff would be 0% because of the Republican dude who would have won. So Republicans are much faster to get to what I just said there. And Democrats are more likely to have a primary in Peterborough, which is a D plus gazillion, and end up primarying out Ivy Van, who is not a moderate or conservative by any standard, and she got primaried right out. That's a longer story, but it's like what we see. We don't see that a lot on the Republican side and it's because of this ideational power thing the NRA does so well.
Steve, I'm also thinking about.
Wait, here. Oh, that's it.
I think one of the other trends, and there was a lot of talk about the gender split. It's always been there, or it's been there for a long time, but it seemed more dramatic this time, particularly among younger men. And I think one of the things that Republicans have done almost surreptitiously, certainly evilly, but is try to issues like abortion, like even climate change, government regulation, they tried to feminize them And by that, I mean, in their view, make them weak. So they talk about the nanny state. They talk about climate in a way that is sort of, it's, you have to be a softie to really care about climate. So there's a lot of, in their messaging, a lot of strength, a lot of, to the point of almost being, to the point of being beyond bullies. They take that brand, if you will, and push it really hard. And I think, frankly, I think among, it's particularly surprising. The numbers weren't nearly as big as the media tried to make, and certainly as Republicans tried to make. But there was a movement among men of color, and certainly among, younger white men. So I think there's a genderization of language as well that is it may not be a major part of it, but I think it is a part of it.
I've heard strategists on the Republican side, they overtly talk about that as an element of strategy. The gender gap for men, Republicans, is now about as big as the gender gap for women in our favor, which has kind of zeroed out what was an advantage for us for a long time.
I think that's a really interesting point. These are all really interesting points. One of the things that really resonates with me in your presentation is about the need to add the economy to our brand. I certainly saw that on the campaign trail because I knocked doors when I was in my primary. I spent a lot of time talking about abortion, and I got to talk about climate change and the existential threat to democracy. And those were the things with high engaged Democrats. And then after the primary, I intentionally went and knocked doors in the red leaning towns in my district where there were, the candidates who were on your list of really competitive races within my district. And it was, even though most of those people were registered Democrats or they were undeclareds who were maybe had a proclivity to vote for Democrats, they did not sound anything like the Democrats I had just spent the last year and a half talking to. And I think it was really about the economy for them. These were a lot of people who were struggling to pay their bills, like you were talking about, and that talking about abortion or talking about climate change, these were just not things that were the highest priority for them. I think they were things they cared about. They were kind of like, okay, but that's not the most important thing on the top of my mind right now. One of the things I'm concerned about, though, is to me, this needs to be a both and, not an either or. I don't think that Democrats can give up making sure that abortion is something that we are committed to protecting. I think we need to make sure that we are committed to standing up for trans kids and LGBTQ plus rights and climate change and all these things. And I think we also have to talk about the economy. And I'm a little concerned sometimes that I feel like some people make it a bit of a choice between the two, that we can't do both. And I guess, can you talk about that?
It's such an important point that a low engagement Democrat is just as pro-choice as a high engagement Democrat. And the polling showed this. A low engagement Democrat is just as believes that climate change is real and that humans have a lot to do with it and that it's a real big problem at similar levels to what high engagement Democrats do. So if we suddenly were like, if we just moved on abortion, if we just stopped talking about climate, or if we changed our positions. And I do hear some prominent Democrats at the national level where the implication is more of this like move to the center, as in change your position. And that's actually not reading what the polling showed. The low engagement Democrats they're with us on the issue. The problem is not ideological. The problem is prioritizational. Mm-hmm. So to your point, it wasn't that we sent a piece of mail or a couple of pieces of mail talking about how important reproductive rights were and that Democrats were on the right side of history on that. Yes, it was the 6 piece on it. Right? And so for example, from a budgetary point of view, I mean, campaign budgetary, if, let's say that you had and I'm making up numbers here, let's say that you had a 10-piece mail program. That's not unusual in some of these contexts. If you had fewer pieces where the marginal benefit of a mail piece, and it depends on the district and so forth, but it does begin to flatten out after a certain number. So the value, the marginal benefit starts flattening out. If you were to take some of the cost without reducing much of the marginal benefit, by the way, right? If you're pulling that out and you were to redirect those resources to, for example, fewer mail pieces, but they would be a little more expensive because they would have more specific characteristics that match the district. I would argue, just to take numbers for illustrative purposes, a 6 mail piece program that was better tailored for the unique characteristics, pro and con, right? The matchups of the candidates would be a more effective use of the same dollar than, say, a 9 or 10 piece mail program that was not reflecting the unique opportunities that each one does, or that just kept hammering home the same message at the expense of being like, hey, the cost really hurts. At the end, some of my, I used some PAC money on a handful of districts to try out some mail pieces, and because they weren't getting this cost message. So there was one we did in Goffstown that was, so I was talking to somebody in Goffstown, and that's where I went to high school. I know the town very well. And it's one of the target districts, and it will be again next time. And they were all the same message. Candidates going, man, they want to talk about the price of eggs. Geez, what they do? Price of eggs. None of our mail talks about the price of eggs. I'm like, all right, I'll help pay for a piece of mail with you about that. So they're like, well, what can we say that communicates it? I'm like, how about we put a picture of eggs on the mail? Like, we don't have to get cute. So then I was working with somebody there, and we were joking around, and I said, boy, I'll tell you, you know who the best candidate in either party would be right now? A chicken. Because a chicken's the one candidate that can actually do something about egg production. So we joke. About an hour after I hang up the phone, this person who doubles as a graphic artist creates this quick mock-up, really nice job, of a piece of mail. And it was a dozen eggs open, and it had a chicken. And the chicken had a speech balloon, which is already we're most of the way, in my opinion.
High tech, yeah.
It's just some good fun. And the chicken, and by the way, you're going to read the piece of mail because it's not for people looking like the candidate's most interesting person since Kennedy. And the chicken says, "My clucking taxes are through the roost." I'm like, aha, that's what I want. This is what I want. And then we worked it in and we fixed it a little bit. We did some messaging. They sent it out. Now, we did not flip the seats. But I would also say it was one piece of mail a week before the election. You could do an entire campaign that, I believe in the power of humor to make serious points. And when you're trying to say stuff about eggs, just put the eggs on the piece. Yes.
Yeah, I actually saw that ad and I thought it was fabulous. I have 2 questions for you. The first one is, the second one's going to come back to multiple pieces of mail on one issue.
Oh.
But first, I'm going to ask this question. Since a lot of us are involved in state and local party work, what does this look like for New Hampshire Dems operationally? That's one. A more poll-aligned messaging team at the state level and local parties. Next part's great. Working with candidates to keep them more on message. What infrastructure do Dems need to build to be able to implement your suggestions? So there are 3 questions there, and good luck at keeping a candidate for governor on message. Anyway.
Well, my staff back in the day would have bemoaned the same problem if I'm being candid.
Yeah.
So there's some structural, there's the stuff that's not sexy, but matters a lot. And if you don't get that right, it's hard to get to the other stuff. So personally, you know my bias, I think a more, what we call in sports, sabermetric or analytics approach to identifying opportunities earlier in the cycle for down ballot candidates would be, that's a cultural change. I'm not saying that elements of that are not being done. I'm saying there's a whole nother level of that you could be doing that I think the Republicans, frankly, are doing better than we are. So there's that element of it. It's a more analytics-driven, local-based approach. That's one mechanic. A second one is an explicit investment in understanding, reaching out to, making connection with what we've described tonight as the emerging swing voter, and away from what we have been investing in over the last several cycles at the state and national level as what was a swing voter. Because I don't know that it'll be like this forever, but I do think it'll be like this for a while. So those are two pretty macro big things that we got to change, that would have structural. It would change how you'd spend the money. It would change who you'd hire, and it would change how you'd prioritize. The relationship between the local, regional, county committee and the candidates. I mean, I love getting to a point where I think decreasingly of towns and their local committees, and I think increasingly of collections of towns by their political subdivisions. So, like, for example, when I think about, let me come up with a really good example here. So already I've done some of it. Actually, next Friday night, I'm going to be in Madison, up in just south of Conway and the northern part of Carroll County. So Conway has become very blue. And it took a long time to pick off the third seat, but we did. Kind of the same story as Pat Bromley kind of thing. So there's now the towns south there are getting competitive. And there's this one district, I think it's District 3, that is a collection of 3 towns: Tamworth, Madison, and Moultonborough, if my memory's right. So one of them is pretty blue, one of them is purpley getting blue, and the other is pretty red, but beginning to become better because the whole demographic thing's happening. We're getting the 3 towns together next Friday night. I think it's like a potluck thing, and then more of a, like, let's get it on here for several hours. And then, but getting the 3 towns culturally to think like one. Because if Tamworth does better, but Moultonborough and Madison, or anyone does better, but the other 2 do not harmonize, then we're not in a fundamentally better place. And the only thing that really matters at the end of the day, winning. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a thing that the local committees and the counties can help, but to think of the town committees less as towns and more as political subdivisions.
Okay, and I want to ask the second question, which is just related to your reference to multiple pieces of mail that address one issue. And the exception that comes to mind in terms of a successful campaign, or at least a win, was Maggie Goodlander, because I received 16 pieces of mail and the solitary issue was abortion on every single one of them. I kept them. And so it granted.
Were those all from after?
No, they were most certainly not. No, most of them were before the primary.
That's what I was saying.
Oh,
like, I think like
that's
during
why.
a primary.
No, but they kept going after the primary. They kept going.
Oh, yeah. Now, I would say federal races are different in that regard for 2 reasons. One, before the primary, I would just, if I thought as a federal candidate, a congressional candidate, that I could drive a Mack truck through one issue over my opponent, regardless of, I'm not getting into the specifics of that race and that choice.
No, I understand.
Then I would just drive that Mack truck all day, every day, until there was evidence that it wasn't working. There is a lot. Look, in 2018, I lived it, not in a federal race, but a state race, a state primary, where I did not have the funds of my opponent in a year where being a straight white guy was about the same as eating rat poison. Like, we lost 66 out of 67 races between one woman and one straight white guy. Straight white guy lost. I was one of the 66. And the women running in those primaries all knew it. And there was nothing you could do. And anytime I said the word she, Emily's List would do it. Like, it didn't matter. You didn't have to run on any issues. All you had to do is be like, look at him. Him. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, what can I do? And to some extent, that remains the case in primaries. I go back to, I can talk about, there was an extent of that in Karen's primary with Mike. There was an extent of that in Maggie's primary against Colin. Declan McEachran is royalty in that state Senate district against an awesome Rebecca Quokka. Declan thought for sure he was going to win that primary. I know that district as well as anybody. I told Declan, don't do it. You're going to lose by 25. I told him on primary night, apologized. I was wrong. He lost by 27. I lost by 31 points. Like, you got no chance. And so if I am the woman running in a head-to-head, I'm just driving a Mack truck, and the closest proxy we have in polling to that is abortion, not because her opponent, Colin, was like lousy on abortion or anything. It's nothing like that at all. But to voters, they see, I know this, I see the polling. They see a woman versus a guy, and she's like, I'm pro-choice. I'm Maggie. And then they're like, and he's Colin. But you don't have to say he stinks on abortion. It would not be true in that case. And it wouldn't work. So that's what they do. So that in the general election also, she was running against a uniquely lousy candidate.
Oh, absolutely.
And where the abortion issue was a Mack truck issue. So I would keep driving that truck as long as you can. If they had run a better candidate who maybe was at least nominally pro-choice, she would have pivoted. I mean, she's a sophisticated candidate, and she would have pivoted to whatever the Mack truck issue would be.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Is there any more questions online we should attend to? I'm gonna let Sue have a question here.
Yeah, I have a hard time because I'm obsessed with taxes. I have a hard time getting that out of the economy issue. But I noticed that on this national poll, the voters said that the Republican Party taxes was their third issue, and the voters said the taxes was the fourth issue, and they thought that the Democratic Party didn't mention it. I didn't realize this was national. It's certainly been a real problem in New Hampshire for some time because they think taxes, they don't want us to talk about taxes. So the voters, they get away with the voters thinking that the property tax belongs to the town and the school rather than to the state. And in the State House now, they've gotten to the point where they're talking about that the property tax is just a local issue. It's their problem. And if they can't figure out how to cut it, they ought to learn how to cut it.
This is, I'm so glad you mentioned this before we finished up. And there are multiple pieces that I've written in the last month that get at this in a pretty candid and prescriptive way for New Hampshire Democrats. There is a frontier. I use the example of the conservative candidate for prime minister later this year in Canada, where the Trump thing has messed that up quite a bit in the last month. But his name's Paul Poilievre. And he has taken the conservatives from the depths of electoral despair to a pretty, until recently, dominant position, largely by an axe the tax, simple, repeated incessantly, tax, it's a carbon tax up there. And the liberals up there did not have a real good way to combat that. In 2026 and beyond, we're in a race right now, like a foot race between the Republicans and Democrats to define whether or not property taxes are the fault of lousy Republican policy at the state level, raining down the pain at the local level. And that should be part of what big taxes are. Or if Kelly and the Republicans are going to win, and they're trying. Oh, yeah. Her budget address said it. Her inaugural address said it. They're all saying it. You guys hear more than I do.
Spending like drunken sailors.
Right? It's, hey, blame your selectmen, blame your school board. It's profligate spenders at the local level. We're giving them more money than ever. And, inflation isn't a thing. So all of a sudden, inflation isn't a thing, by the way, when they say that. So one of us is going to win the race to define that. Somebody asked me the other day, I think it was in Londonderry, what are we going to do? Because the Republicans successfully turned any talk about revenue into a third rail of politics. Democrats now, I mentioned if you aren't for codifying abortion rights, you couldn't win a Democratic primary. I'm not sure you could win a Democratic primary right now if you didn't take the pledge. I think that there's a lot of folks who would agree that we have a revenue shortfall and a structural problem, but that if you dared say it, you would be cooked. And so we don't want to take that chance in the general. Okay? So that's how third rail has become. The Republicans had a third rail, and they used to touch it. Every time they nominated Ovid LaMontagne for governor, they touched it. The 2 times in the last 42 years that we won an open governor's seat, which is really the only way to win a governor's seat in New Hampshire, except once in history, is to win it when it's open. And only 2 times in the last 42 years we won it were literally the 2 times Ovid LaMontagne was the nominee. 96 against Shaheen, 12 against Hassan, because not only is he pro-life, he loves it. He's as authentic on the issue as anybody could be. Nobody doubts his passion about it. And he's like, what? What's wrong with saying I'm against gay marriage and I'm totally from conception pro-life? And then he gets 41% of the vote and the Republicans go, They finally appear to have, at least for now, learned not to touch the rail. So Kelly spent $20 million and her allies to say, hey, we're fine on it. We're not touching the law. We're not touching it. There were 10 sponsors, co-sponsors for that. Was it a 15-week ban? Mm-hmm. And then they were about to do the stuff. And then all of a sudden, I think Kelly was like, don't you put that in your mouth. Do not touch that. All of a sudden, they're not for it. And these are folks that I know are hardcore. Yeah. And they are not touching it. So they're not touching their third rail. And they've gotten us to not touch this third. They're defining all the rails. And so we have to pick something quick. And we have to own it. Or else we're going to be playing defense again. And I think this gets to the point in Londonderry where they're like, what is it? If you're going to do it, there's a little bit of Nixon going to China. And my number one regret, because I'm never running for stuff again, but the thing I wanted to do more than anything, but all people want to talk about was I wanted to legalize weed and codify abortion. So I never got to the thing I actually wanted to do the most, which was we have the most inefficient education delivery system in America for how we fund schools. We have a collapsing student population due to demographics, and yet we have an increasing number of SAUs, which gives us the second highest administrative cost in the country, which means we spend $22,000 a year in kids. The Republicans say it's evidence of fraud, waste, abuse, and DEI. All of that is false. When actually we have this 19th century system of delivering the education system as we lose the number of kids. And it means that not only the money's not going to teacher pay, it's leaking outside the classroom. We know teacher pay is where the action really happens. If you fix that, then you can have an argument about funding education from the state level, where another one of my pieces shows we fund it more at the local level than any state in America, which means that when a kid leaves my town and goes to your town, most of the money to pay for the kid doesn't follow the kid. It goes to your town, which is the single biggest reason why we won't get more housing. Because it's easier to zone kids out by having zoning that minimizes the chance of lower income people and kids and density. So if you want to solve the housing problem, you actually kind of have to solve the education funding problem. And housing is the number one issue. If Democrats could connect those dots for people and show the competency and how you could actually pay for it efficiently, Republicans wouldn't know what to do with all the Doge and Doge in the world, because that's got nothing to do with good government, right? What they're doing. That's sitting there if we were to own that sort of suite of issues that includes housing, property taxes, and education. Those are the 3 issues that matter most to the people in New Hampshire. It's sitting there. I just hope somebody will run that can do it, that can put 3 sentences together and be interesting while they're doing it. That's my wish.
So let's everybody thank Steve for giving his time tonight. What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Steve. Okay, 2 thoughts before we say goodnight. We did not touch on what do we think the brand of New Hampshire Democrats are, and what should be the brand of New Hampshire Democrats. And this is an issue that's close to me, but I'm sure there are others in the room who also will be turning this thought over for the next few weeks. I think it's something we need to dedicate more time thinking about as a state, and a party here in the state. So, let's invite Steve back to talk about that.
And we do a whole night just on that and just focus group that stuff.
And the other thing is, you just spoke about Coj and Doge. And I'm wondering what mental image comes to your mind when you think of Doge? Because mine is a picture of a corgi face.
Oh, right. It's that like husky-ish corgi
Yeah.
space.
Yeah. So I think it's a good hook from the start.
We end where we start.
We end where we start. Yes.
All
Thank
roads end in corgi.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Steve, so much for your time and your
Thank
insight.
you guys.
We could do this for another hour for sure.
But we're done with
But
this
I know
right
there
now,
are
yeah.
folks at home who probably need to tune off and others who have to head out. So thank you so much for coming tonight, team. Stay tuned for a secondary wrap up with Steve at another
Yeah,
junction.
good
We have
idea.
more time there. Thank you.